You're late.
What does a man owe to a ghost? That was the question first Blade Korrin Vey had been asking himself for 12 years, ever since the report came across his desk with a stamp that should have ended the question forever. Confirmed casualty. No remains recovered. He had read those 4 words so many times that they had worn smooth in his mind, the way river stones wear smooth, until they no longer felt like information at all, just a shape his grief had learned to hold. He had built an entire life on top of that stamp, a career. A quiet, disciplined kind of peace. And on a gray afternoon on a world he had visited exactly once before, for exactly one reason, a door opened at the end of a corridor he had not asked to walk down, and the woman standing in it said his name the way only one person in the galaxy had ever said it. And every year of that carefully built peace came apart in the space of a single breath. Most people, faced with a report like the one Korrin Vey received 12 years earlier, learn eventually to let it settle, the way grief usually does, into something you carry rather than something you fight. He never quite managed that. He built an entire career, an entire reputation, an entire philosophy of command around not managing it, and it is worth understanding before we go any further that everything that happened on that gray afternoon was not luck, and it was not coincidence. It was the direct, cumulative result of a man who simply refused, for 12 consecutive years, to finish grieving someone the paperwork had told him was already gone. Hold on to that, because the door and what stood behind it is where this story ends. But you cannot understand the weight of that door until you understand exactly what it cost him to believe, for 12 years, that it would never open at all. Let's begin. Korrin Vey met Captain Mara Voss during the worst 6 hours of both their military careers, which is, if you have ever served alongside anyone worth serving alongside, usually how the deepest loyalties get built. He was a junior tactical officer of the Ashari Compact at the time, 26 years old in the reckoning of his own people, assigned as liaison to a joint human-Ashari task force patrolling a contested border system that neither side had bothered to name properly, because neither side had expected to hold it long enough to justify the paperwork. Mara Voss commanded the human vessel Meridian, a mid-tonnage escort ship with an aging reactor and a crew that trusted her the specific, unshowy way crews trust captains who have never once asked them to take a risk she wasn't willing to take herself. But the worst 6 hours were not the whole of what they shared, and it is worth pausing on the 4 months that came before them, because those months are where the trust that made those 6 hours possible was actually built. Joint task forces of that era were, by most accounts, uneasy arrangements, staffed by two military cultures that shared almost no common assumptions about rank, protocol, or the acceptable margin of risk in a given engagement. Ashari command doctrine at the time still leaned heavily on rigid hierarchy and centralized decision-making, a legacy of the same political structures that would later produce the very reforms Korrin Vey spent his career championing. Human naval doctrine, by contrast, tended to grant individual captains a degree of tactical discretion that more than one Ashari liaison officer before Korrin had found genuinely unsettling. He arrived at the joint posting expecting friction, and for the first several weeks, friction was exactly what he found, mostly in the form of a human captain who seemed constitutionally incapable of waiting for authorization before acting on her own judgment. Their first real disagreement came during a routine supply escort in the 4th week of the joint patrol, when Mara Voss altered the Meridian's approach vector without first clearing the change through the Ashari cruiser's tactical desk. A minor breach of protocol by any measure, but one that Korrin, still finding his footing in a role that required him to enforce exactly this kind of procedural discipline, felt obligated to formally raise with her afterward. She had listened to his objection without interrupting, in a small briefing room that smelled faintly of recycled coffee and overworked ventilation, and had then asked him, with a directness that caught him off guard, whether he had actually checked the sensor data that had prompted her course change before deciding the maneuver was unjustified. He had not. She showed him. A debris pattern inconsistent with the navigational hazard reports on file, subtle enough that the Ashari cruiser's own sensor suite had not flagged it, but glaring enough, once she pointed it out, that he understood immediately she had adjusted course to avoid a collision risk nobody else aboard either ship had yet identified. He apologized, she told him in the plain, unadorned way he would come to recognize as characteristic of her, that she didn't need the apology. She needed him to trust her judgment enough to ask questions before assuming the worst of it, and that if he was willing to do that, she was willing to do the same for him whenever his own judgment ran ahead of what the paperwork said he was allowed to do. It became, over the following months, something close to their operating philosophy, an informal pact neither of them ever wrote down but both of them upheld with a consistency that eventually made them, by more than one outside observer's account, the most effective command pairing in the entire Joint Task Force. She taught him, without ever framing it as instruction, that discipline and rigidity were not the same thing, that the best officers held their principles firmly and their assumptions loosely. He taught her in turn, though he would have said this was the smaller half of the exchange, a measure of Ashari patience that softened some of the impulsiveness her own crew occasionally worried about, a habit of pausing one full breath before committing to a course of action, a habit she kept, he would later learn, for the rest of her life. By the time the ambush came, 4 months into the joint patrol, Korrin Vey did not think of Mara Voss as a foreign captain he had been assigned to liaise with. He thought of her, in the quiet, unspoken way soldiers sometimes come to think of the people who have earned it, as someone whose judgment he trusted more completely than his own, and it was precisely that trust, built in briefing rooms and shared meals, and 100 small unremarkable moments over 4 unremarkable months, that made the 6 hours that followed cut as deep as they did. The ambush came without warning, the way the worst ones always do. A raider consortium operating outside any recognized chain of command, exploiting the exact seam of unclaimed space the task force had been sent to patrol, hit both vessels simultaneously with a coordinated strike that crippled the Ashari cruiser's shield generators within the first 90 seconds. Korrin remembered the sequence of that night with a clarity that had never once faded, not in 12 years, not through every attempt his own mind had made to blur it into something survivable. He remembered the hull breach on Deck 4. He remembered the emergency bulkheads failing to seal, because the raiders had specifically targeted the redundancy systems, a level of tactical sophistication that told every officer present this was not opportunistic piracy, but something planned, something patient, something that had studied its targets for longer than anyone was comfortable admitting. The first 30 seconds of the engagement were, by every account later reconstructed from both ships' sensor logs, a study in exactly how badly a coordinated ambush can unravel a routine patrol. The raider vessels had emerged from a sensor-blind approach vector that neither ship's tactical desk had flagged as a credible threat corridor, a gap in coverage that Ashari and human intelligence officers spent years afterward arguing over whose doctrine had failed to anticipate it. Korrin was at the tactical station when the first strike landed, close enough to the initial impact that the shockwave threw the deck plating through him against a support strut before he had fully registered what was happening, and it was in the disoriented, half-conscious seconds that followed that he heard Mara Voss's voice cut through the chaos on the open channel, steadier than anything else in that moment had any right to be. He remembered, most of all, the voice on the open channel that was not his captain's voice, not any Ashari voice at all, but Mara Voss's, calm in a way that should not have been possible given what she was looking at on her own sensors, informing him that the Meridian was diverting from its assigned defensive position to draw raider fire away from the crippled Ashari cruiser. an action that violated no fewer than 3 articles of the Joint Task Force's engagement protocol, and which she executed anyway, without hesitation, because, as she put it in the 2 clipped sentences the ship's recorder later preserved, "Protocol assumes both ships make it home, and I am not leaving people to die because a document didn't anticipate this." Korrin Vey was 26 years old, half conscious from a concussion sustained when a support strut collapsed across the tactical deck, and he watched through a cracked viewport as the Meridian absorbed fire meant for his ship, watched its shields buckle, watched it take a hit along its aft section that sent debris scattering across the black, in a pattern his mind would replay, unbidden, for over a decade afterward. The Meridian's final transmission was 11 seconds long. Most of it was static. The part that survived clean enough to be preserved in the official record was Mara Voss's voice, still calm, ill steady, informing anyone still listening that she was proud of her crew, and that the Ashari cruiser had better make it home, because somebody needed to remember that this had happened for a reason worth remembering. The Ashari cruiser made it home. Korrin Vey did not remember much of the 2 days that followed, though he remembered with painful specificity the moment a senior officer informed him that search protocols had concluded, that the debris field showed no viable life signs, and that Captain Voss and the remainder of her crew were being formally logged as killed in action, no remains recovered. He carried that stamp for 12 years the way some people carry a scar they've stopped noticing consciously, but never stopped feeling, in the particular ache before rain, in the particular tightness of an old wound remembering weather. He rose steadily through Ashari Naval Command in the years that followed, not because ambition drove him especially hard, but because he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that the discipline of duty gave shape to a grief that otherwise had none. He never married. He kept, in the small personal effects locker every Ashari officer is permitted aboard ship, a single physical object salvaged from the Joint Task Force's shared quarters before the Meridian's records were sealed, a chipped ceramic mug with a faded human insignia that Mara Voss had once used to make him try what she called coffee, and what he privately considered an act of mild chemical warfare. He never told anyone why he kept it. Ashari culture does not have a formal word for the specific grief of surviving because someone chose, without being asked, to die in your place, but if it did, Korrin Vey would have spent 12 years being fluent in it. What almost none of his officers knew, because he never spoke of it to anyone beneath his own rank and rarely to anyone above it, was that the formal casualty stamp on Mara Voss's file had never fully closed the matter for him, however much duty demanded he behave as though it had. Every year on the anniversary of the ambush, he requested, through channels he kept deliberately quiet, a review of any new intelligence that had surfaced regarding the Raider Consortium's operations in that sector, a habit that began as a genuine tactical exercise and slowly, over the years, became something closer to a private ritual he could not quite bring himself to abandon, even after a full decade had passed with nothing to show for it. He visited, twice in 12 years, a modest memorial wall on a border outpost near where the ambush had taken place, a wall bearing the names of every crew member lost that night, and he stood in front of Mara Voss's name both times for longer than either visit strictly required, in a silence his aides at the time had learned not to interrupt. He told himself, across those 12 years, that the searches and the visits were simply the disciplined thoroughness expected of an officer who had witnessed the ambush firsthand, that they were about honoring the dead properly rather than doubting the finality of what had happened to them. It was, he would later admit, a distinction that grew thinner every year, and by the time the recovery report finally crossed his desk, he had long since stopped fully believing it himself. Some part of him, he confessed once the truth of her survival was no longer in question, had simply never been able to close the file the way the official record insisted he should, and he had spent 12 years quietly, privately, refusing to let a stamped document be the final word on a woman who had spent her own last, recorded breath insisting that documents did not get to decide who mattered. He rose, eventually, to the rank of First Blade, a title that in a Shari command structure denotes something close to a fleet admiral crossed with a senior diplomatic authority, responsible for exactly the kind of contested border regions that had once cost him the person he most respected in either of his two military careers, human or a Shari. He became known, quietly, among the officers who served under him, for an unusual and occasionally inconvenient habit. He never left anyone behind, not stranded crews, not damaged vessels that other commanders would have written off as acceptable losses, not, on 3 separate occasions that became something close to legend within his fleet, prisoners whose recovery cost more in resources than any tactical assessment could justify. His staff eventually stopped questioning the pattern. They understood, without ever being told directly, that their commander was still, in some fundamental way, fighting to undo a debt from a night that had happened before most of them had entered service. There was, in particular, an incident 9 years into his command tenure that his officers still discussed in low voices whenever the subject of his character came up among new recruits. A supply convoy under his authority had been struck in a minor border skirmish, its escort vessel disabled and drifting with a skeleton crew of 11, well beyond any reasonable rescue window given the tactical situation unfolding elsewhere in the sector at the time. 2 senior officers on his own staff had recommended, with sound strategic reasoning behind the recommendation, that resources be redirected toward the more consequential engagement, rather than a costly rescue of a single disabled vessel whose crew, by every standard model of survival probability, was unlikely to still be alive by the time any relief force could reach them. Korrin Vey had listened to the full briefing without interrupting, and had then, calmly, overridden both recommendations, diverting a rescue element at a cost that drew formal inquiry from Ashari High Command afterward. All 11 crew members were recovered alive. He never fully explained his reasoning to the inquiry board beyond a single line that was later quoted, without his permission, in a junior officer's memoir of her service under his command. He said that probability is not the same thing as certainty, and that he had already lived through what it costs to be wrong about who gets left behind, and he did not intend to make that particular mistake twice in one lifetime if there was any reasonable way to avoid it. He was 51 years old by Ashari reckoning, when a report crossed his desk that had nothing on its surface to do with any of this. The report concerned a black site detention facility discovered during the collapse of the Raider Consortium's remaining command structure, a faction finally broken after a decade of slow, grinding attrition, warfare that neither human nor Ashari forces had ever fully won outright, only outlasted. The facility, buried in an asteroid cluster far outside any patrolled trade route, had operated for years beyond the reach of either government's search efforts, its existence known only to a shrinking circle of Raider leadership who had, apparently, found it useful to keep certain high-value captives alive rather than executed, as leverage that was never, in the end, actually used. When Ashari recovery forces finally breached the facility, they found it largely abandoned, its remaining Raider personnel having fled weeks earlier as the consortium's broader collapse accelerated, leaving behind only a handful of prisoners too weak, too long held, or too carefully guarded to have been worth evacuating. Korrin Vey did not personally review recovery reports of this kind as a matter of routine. His staff handled the operational detail. His role, at First Blade rank, was strategic oversight, not individual case files. He would, in fact, later admit that he very nearly did not read this particular report at all, that it reached his desk buried in a routine batch of post-operation summaries he had been planning to delegate to a subordinate before catching, almost by accident, a single line in the preliminary biometric scan of the recovered prisoners. Species classification, human. Estimated age at capture, mid-30s. Partial identification pending due to degraded records. He told his aide, years later, in one of the only unguarded conversations he ever gave on the subject, that he had known, before the identification was even confirmed, before the biometric match came back, before any rational part of his mind had permission to hope. He had known the way you know a familiar voice through static, the way certainty sometimes arrives ahead of the evidence that's supposed to justify it. He requested the full file himself, personally, at an hour of the night his staff would later describe as deeply out of character for a commander known for his disciplined schedule, and he read it standing up, in his private quarters, with the chipped ceramic mug sitting on the shelf above his desk where it had sat, untouched and unexplained, for 12 years. Now let's slow down here, because the temptation in a story like this is to rush toward the reunion, and that would betray exactly the kind of patience Mara Voss herself would have insisted on. 12 years is not a gap you close in a single scene. It is a gap you close the way water closes over a stone slowly, from every direction at once, and it is worth understanding what those 12 years had actually done to the two people about to stand on either side of that door. Mara Voss had not, as the official record insisted for over a decade, died in the debris field alongside most of her crew. She had, along with 4 surviving members of the Meridian's engineering section, been recovered by the same raider consortium responsible for the ambush, not out of mercy, but out of the same cold calculation that had targeted her ship's redundancy systems in the first place. A captured human officer of her rank and reputation, they had judged, correctly, might eventually prove useful as leverage, and so instead of being executed alongside the wreckage their sensors had already logged as a total loss, she and her surviving crew had been transported, in conditions the recovery teams would later describe in clinical, restrained language that did nothing to soften the reality underneath it, to the black site facility that would become the entirety of her known world for the next 12 years. She never gave them what they wanted. This is the part of the story that matters most, and it is worth saying plainly rather than dressing it up in euphemism, because the truth of it carries more weight than any embellishment could add. Over 12 years of captivity across multiple attempts, some patient and some considerably less patient, the Raider Consortium tried repeatedly to extract fleet codes, patrol patterns, and command structure intelligence from a woman who had, by any reasonable calculation, no remaining strategic reason to protect any of it. Her ship was gone. Her original crew, all but 4, were dead. The war she had been fighting had moved on so far beyond the borders she'd once patrolled that half the intelligence she carried had likely gone obsolete within the first 2 years of her captivity. She could have given them something, anything, outdated and useless enough to buy herself easier treatment, and no reasonable person on either side of the conflict would have blamed her for it. She never gave them anything, not because she was certain it still mattered strategically, because, as she would explain years later in a debrief that the interviewing officer described as one of the most quietly devastating documents he had ever filed, she had decided, somewhere in the first brutal months of captivity, that the version of herself who gave up information under duress was not a version of herself she was willing to survive as. It was not about the codes anymore, she said. It was about what kind of person walked out of that facility, if she ever walked out at all. She intended, if she lived, to walk out as someone Korrin Vey and the rest of her lost crew would have recognized. And if she did not live, she intended to die as that same person, rather than as someone the raiders had managed to reshape into something smaller. The 4 surviving members of her crew, when finally interviewed separately during the recovery process, described the same handful of details independently, without any apparent coordination, in a way that gave investigators an unusual degree of confidence in the account each of them gave. They described a woman who, in the earliest and most brutal months of captivity, had absorbed a disproportionate share of the raiders' attention, specifically to draw it away from the younger members of her crew. A junior engineer barely into his 20s, who had frozen entirely during the first extraction attempt, and who Mara Voss had, according to his own later testimony, physically placed herself between and the interrogators on no fewer than 3 separate occasions before the raiders eventually concluded, wrongly, that she alone held whatever value the facility's leadership believed the group possessed. They described a rationing system she implemented within the first month, dividing whatever meager supplies the facility grudgingly provided into equal shares regardless of rank, a decision that cost her personally, given that her own position as the highest-ranking captive would ordinarily have entitled her, under any conventional hierarchy, to more. They described, too, the nights that were hardest, the ones where the facility's isolation chambers were used as a specific and deliberate psychological tactic, each captive separated from the others for stretches that sometimes ran days at a time, designed explicitly to erode the sense of shared identity that had been keeping all of them intact. Mara Voss, they said, had developed a method of marking time during those isolated stretches, a small system of counted breaths and remembered names, and had taught it to each of them individually during the brief windows when they were allowed contact, specifically so that isolation would never again feel, to any of them, like erasure. One of the 4, a woman named Petra Elin, who had served as the Meridian's junior communications officer, and who had been barely 24 years old at the time of capture, told investigators that she had survived her longest single stretch of isolation, 11 days in total, by silently reciting the names of every person aboard the Meridian in the exact order Voss had taught her, over and over, because Voss had told her once. In the brief seconds they'd had together before the separation began, that a name spoken enough times refuses to be forgotten, and a person who refuses to be forgotten is a person who is still, in some essential way, still present. The facility itself, once fully surveyed by recovery forces, turned out to be smaller and more improvised than either government's initial intelligence assumptions had suggested. A converted mining processing station retrofitted with detention infrastructure by a raider faction that had never intended it as a long-term installation, only a temporary holding site that had, through the ordinary inertia of a decade-long war, simply never been dismantled. It was run, for the better part of Mara Voss's captivity, by a raider officer the surviving prisoners knew only by a designation rather than a name, a woman the facility's remaining staff addressed with a title that translated, roughly, to overseer, and whose particular brand of patience the 4 surviving crew members described, independently, as the most unsettling thing about the entire facility. She did not favor the crude tactics some of her subordinates occasionally reached for. She favored time. She favored the slow erosion of resolve through isolation, through the studied removal of anything resembling comfort or routine, through a psychological patience that assumed, correctly in the case of most prisoners the facility had processed before Mara Voss arrived, that everyone eventually breaks if you are simply willing to wait long enough. Mara Voss was, by every account gathered afterward, the first captive in the facility's operational history that the overseer never managed to break, and the surviving crew members described a specific turning point in that long, grinding contest of wills, roughly 3 years into the captivity, that had become something close to legend among the 4 of them by the time recovery forces finally arrived. The overseer, having exhausted more conventional approaches, had ordered an extraction attempt targeting Petra Elin directly, correctly calculating that threatening the youngest and least experienced of the surviving crew might succeed where direct pressure on Voss herself had consistently failed. Mara Voss, informed of the session already underway through channels the facility's own guards had not intended her to have access to, had done something that every one of the surviving crew members described, without exception, as the single bravest thing they had ever personally witnessed. She had demanded, through the facility's own internal communication system, patched together by Petra herself during an earlier, unsupervised maintenance window, to be substituted in Petra's place, offering, in terms precise enough that the overseer could not easily refuse without appearing to concede a point of leverage, that she would answer 3 direct questions honestly if the session against Petra was terminated immediately. The overseer agreed. Mara Voss answered exactly 3 questions, each with information so carefully, deliberately hollow, technically true but strategically worthless, dates disconnected from any operational context, names of officers long since reassigned or retired, that the overseer did not realize for nearly 2 full days that she had been given nothing of value at all, by which point Petra Elin had recovered enough to survive whatever might otherwise have followed. It was, the surviving crew agreed, the exact moment they each individually understood that Mara Voss would rather absorb every possible cost the facility could inflict than allow it to fall on someone she considered her responsibility. And it was the moment, more than any other, that the 4 of them privately decided among themselves that they would follow her lead unquestioningly for as long as the captivity lasted, whatever that turned out to cost any of them in return. She kept herself alive across 12 years through methods that the 4 surviving crew members who endured alongside her, and who were eventually recovered in the same operation, would later credit as the entire reason any of them made it out at all. She organized what little routine the facility's brutal conditions allowed into something resembling structure, insisting on shared meals eaten together whenever the guards permitted it, on stories told aloud in the dark to keep 4 traumatized minds from folding entirely inward, on small acts of defiance calibrated precisely enough to preserve dignity, without triggering the kind of retaliation that would have gotten someone killed. She never once, according to every account gathered afterward, allowed herself the luxury of despair in front of her people, reserving whatever private grief she carried for the handful of hours each cycle when she was genuinely alone, because a commander's first job, she told them more times than any of them could count, is to make sure the people under her care believe survival is still possible, whether or not she fully believed it herself on any given day. The final months of captivity, though none of the 5 prisoners knew at the time how close they were to the end of it, were also, in some ways, the most dangerous. As the Raider Consortium's broader command structure began visibly disintegrating under the pressure of a war it was steadily losing across very front, the facility's remaining guard contingent grew smaller, more erratic, and considerably more unpredictable, no longer operating under the overseer's patient, calculated discipline, but under the far more volatile leadership of officers increasingly aware that their own future was collapsing around them. Mara Voss recognized the shift before any of the other captives fully understood what it meant, and she adjusted her own strategy accordingly, shifting from the long, patient endurance that had defined the earlier years of captivity into something closer to careful, deliberate preparation, coaching the 4 surviving crew members, in whatever stolen minutes the guards' distraction allowed, on what to do if an opportunity for escape or rescue ever actually presented itself, how to move, how to conserve strength, how to recognize the difference between a real chance and a trap designed to justify further punishment. That preparation, though it was never ultimately tested by an escape attempt of their own making, meant that, when the recovery force finally breached the facility's lower detention levels, the 5 prisoners they found were disciplined, coordinated, and immediately cooperative in a way that startled the young human medic who led the initial contact, a detail he mentioned specifically in his own after-action report. Noting that the group's composure under conditions that should have produced considerably more disorientation and panic was, in his own words, the most striking thing about the entire recovery. He credited it, correctly, to whoever had been keeping that group together long before any rescue force ever arrived. That right there is the human resilience this story is actually about. Not a rescue mission, not a daring escape through gunfire. A woman choosing, day after day for 12 consecutive years, to remain exactly who she was, at a cost most people would find genuinely unimaginable, because the alternative felt to her like a second death worse than the one everyone already believed she'd suffered. The recovery operation that finally found her was not designed to find her at all. It was, on paper, a routine mopping-up action following the Raider Consortium's broader military collapse, tasked with clearing remaining facilities of value and processing whatever personnel or intelligence remained. The strike force assigned to the operation, a mixed Ashari human unit under the command of an officer who had no prior connection to Korrin Vey's fleet, breached the facility's outer perimeter with minimal resistance, the Raider Guard contingent having already thinned to a skeleton crew in the weeks since the consortium's leadership structure had begun visibly disintegrating. What resistance remained was disorganized, more concerned with personal escape than with holding the facility, and the breach itself, according to the after-action report, took less than 40 minutes from first contact to full facility control. It was in the lower detention levels, the ones the retreating guard contingent had apparently judged too low priority to bother evacuating, that the strike force found the 4 surviving long-term captives, malnourished, several bearing untreated injuries, but alive. And it was the preliminary biometric scan run automatically as part of standard recovery protocol that flagged, almost as an afterthought buried in a routine data packet, the identity that would upend Korrin Vey's understanding of the last 12 years of his life. Korrin Vey did not personally review recovery reports of this kind as a matter of routine. His staff handled the operational detail. His role, at first Blade rank, was strategic oversight, not individual case files. He would, in fact, later admit that he very nearly did not read this particular report at all, that it reached his desk buried in a routine batch of post-operation summaries he had been planning to delegate to a subordinate before catching, almost by accident, a single line in the preliminary biometric scan of the recovered prisoners. Species classification, human. Estimated age at capture, mid-30s. Partial identification pending due to degraded records. He told his aide, years later, in one of the only unguarded conversations he ever gave on the subject, that he had known, before the identification was even confirmed, before the biometric match came back, before any rational part of his mind had permission to hope. He had known the way you know a familiar voice through static, the way certainty sometimes arrives ahead of the evidence that's supposed to justify it. He requested the full file himself, personally, at an hour of the night his staff would later describe as deeply out of character for a commander known for his disciplined schedule, and he read it standing up, in his private quarters, with the chipped ceramic mug sitting on the shelf above his desk where it had sat, untouched and unexplained, for 12 years. By morning, he had done something that violated every principle of delegated command he had spent 30 years building his reputation around. He requested personal transport to the recovery site himself, overriding 2 staff members who gently, and then less gently, pointed out that a First Blade's presence at a routine processing operation was neither necessary nor, strictly speaking, appropriate given the demands on his schedule. He went anyway, telling them only that he had spent 12 years building an entire career around the discipline of never leaving anyone behind, and that if there was even a fraction of a chance, the person who taught him that discipline in the first place was still breathing somewhere in that facility. No schedule on any world was going to keep him from being the one to walk through the door. The aide who accompanied him on the transport out, a young Ashari officer named Cyril Duth, who had served under him for only 2 years and had never before seen anything crack the First Blade's famous composure, later described the flight itself as the longest silence she had ever sat through with another living being. He did not speak for the first 90 minutes. He reviewed the same 3 pages of the recovery report over and over, she said, not because he was searching for new information within them, but because rereading them seemed to be the only thing keeping some larger, unspoken weight from overwhelming him entirely. When he finally spoke, it was not to her directly, more a thought-given voice, because the silence had simply become too heavy to carry alone any longer. He told her that he had spent 12 years building a career around a debt he assumed he would never get the chance to repay, and that he did not yet know what a man was supposed to do when the ledger he'd spent a lifetime settling suddenly, impossibly, reopened. Now we arrive at the door itself. Let's take it slowly, the way it actually happened, because the people who witnessed it firsthand agree that nothing about those next 90 seconds moved quickly at all. The recovery facility's medical wing had been hastily converted from what remained of the raiders' own detention infrastructure. Cold gray corridors lit by temporary field lighting that cast everything in a flat, clinical white. Korrin Vey walked that corridor flanked by 2 aides who had, by that point, given up trying to manage his schedule, and settled instead into simply staying close in case he needed them, though neither of them could have said precisely what kind of need they were anticipating. He stopped outside a sealed medical bay where the facility's recovery team had confirmed, through the biometric match that had arrived only hours earlier, the identity of one of the 4 long-term captives recovered from the deepest level of the compound. The door was not dramatic. It was a standard medical containment door, the kind installed in every field hospital across 100 worlds, sliding open with the unremarkable hiss of pressurized seals releasing, and for a moment in the flat white light beyond it, Korrin Vey saw only a room, a cot, a figure seated upright against the wall in a posture that struck him, even before he could fully process anything else, as unmistakably, achingly familiar. 12 years had taken things from her. He could see that immediately in the gray threading through hair that had once been dark, in a leanness that spoke of scarcity endured rather than chosen, in the careful, deliberate way she held her left arm, favoring an injury that had clearly never been allowed to heal properly. But her spine was straight. Her eyes, when they found him in the doorway, held none of the vacancy he had steeled himself, on the transport out, to possibly find there. They held recognition. Immediate, total, and to his lasting astonishment, something close to amusement. He would spend a long time afterward trying to describe, to the handful of people who ever asked him directly, exactly what those first 2 or 3 seconds felt like, and he never quite managed a satisfying answer. It was not relief, exactly, though relief was somewhere in it. It was closer, he eventually decided, to the specific, disorienting sensation of a held breath finally releasing after being held for so long that the body had half-forgotten breathing was ever meant to be effortless. 12 years of careful, disciplined grief, folded and stored and never fully examined because examining it too closely had always threatened to undo him, simply had nowhere left to go in the space of that doorway, and he felt it leave him all at once, like ballast releasing from a ship that had been running heavy for far longer than anyone had realized. "You're late," Mara Voss said, in a voice roughened by 12 years but carrying, underneath the damage, the exact same steady cadence he remembered from an open comm channel on the worst night of his life. "I've been expecting a rescue for slightly over a decade, Vey. I was starting to think you'd forgotten which sector I was in." He did not answer immediately. He could not. Every disciplined instinct that had carried him through 30 years of Ashari command, every carefully constructed habit of composure his staff had come to rely on, simply failed him at once, and he crossed the small room in 3 strides and knelt at the edge of her cot. And for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, because some reunions are too large for the first available sentence to hold. "I was told you were dead," he finally managed, and his voice, according to the aide who stood witness in the doorway and later gave the only account anyone was ever permitted of that moment, broke on the last word in a way none of his staff had ever heard from him in 3 decades of service. No remains recovered. I read that report so many times I stopped believing there was another version of it possible. There wasn't for a long time, she admitted, and something in her expression shifted, the amusement folding into something quieter, heavier, the specific weight of a person choosing how much of 12 years to share with someone standing in front of her for the first time since it began. I made my peace with dying more than once in that place, Korrin. I want you to know that honestly, because I think you'd see through anything less. There were years I didn't expect to walk out of. But I decided early on that if I was going to die in there, I was going to die as the person you knew, not as whatever they were trying to turn me into. And somewhere in the middle of deciding that, I suppose I just kept deciding it. One day at a time, for longer than I ever expected to have to. He reached for the chipped ceramic mug he had, almost without conscious thought, carried with him on the transport out, tucked into a coat pocket the way another man might carry something considerably more practical, and set it on the small table beside her cot. She looked at it for a long moment, and something in her composure, held together through 12 years of captivity with a discipline that 4 surviving crew members would later describe in tones bordering on reverence, finally, quietly broke. "You kept it," she said, and her voice, for the first time since the door had opened, was not steady at all. "I kept everything," he told her. "I kept your rank in every briefing I gave for 12 years, even when protocol required me to update it. I kept a mug I never once used, because using it felt like admitting you weren't coming back for it. I kept, more than anything, the exact words you said to me on an open channel the night I lost you, that protocol assumes both ships make it home, and that you weren't leaving people to die because a document failed to anticipate the cost. I have spent 12 years trying to be the kind of commander who never makes anyone under him pay that cost again. I did not always succeed, but I never stopped trying, and I think, somewhere underneath everything else in this room, you deserve to know that the reason I never stopped trying was you." Mara Voss was not the only person waiting on the other side of a door that day, and it is worth pausing briefly on the 4 people who walked through their own doors alongside her, because their reunions, though smaller in scale than the one that made headlines across 2 civilizations, carried exactly the same weight for the families who had spent 12 years believing they would never happen at all. Petra Elin's parents, who had held a small private memorial for their daughter 11 years earlier after finally accepting, with the particular exhausted grief of people who have waited as long as reasonably possible, that the search had truly ended, were informed of her recovery by a junior officer who later described the call as the single hardest and most joyful conversation of his entire career, the 2 emotions arriving so close together that neither parent, by their own account, fully separated one from the other for several days afterward. The facility's junior engineer, the one Mara Voss had shielded during the earliest and most brutal months of captivity, returned home to a younger sibling who had been 11 years old at the time of his capture, and was, by the time of his return, a fully grown adult with a family of her own, a gap in time that neither of them ever fully described to outside interviewers, preferring to keep whatever passed between them in that reunion private. These 4 smaller reunions, scattered across 3 different worlds in the days following the recovery, never received the attention that settled around Mara Voss and Korrin Vey, and each of the 4 survivors, when later asked about it, said some version of the same thing without any apparent resentment. They understood that theirs was, in its own way, a story about her as much as it was a story about themselves, because without her part, Icular, stubborn insistence on keeping 5 people intact across 12 years of captivity, none of the 4 of them would have had a door to walk through at all. It is worth remembering, listening to a story built around one extraordinary reunion, that reunions like this one rarely happen in isolation. They ripple outward, into kitchens and living rooms and quiet family conversations on worlds far from wherever the headline event actually took place. And the true scale of what Mara Voss did across 12 years of captivity is measured not only in the door that opened for Korrin Vey, but in the 4 other doors that opened because of the same unbroken will that kept her, and everyone she refused to abandon, alive long enough to walk through them. Here is where the resolution of this story lives, and it is worth being precise about what kind of resolution it actually is, because the story could easily have ended on the door, on the reunion alone, and it would have been a complete and moving story even then. But there is a second half to what happened that day, and it is the half that turns this from a story about grief finally answered into a story about exactly the kind of honor this genre exists to celebrate. When the full debrief of Mara Voss's 12 years in captivity was compiled in the weeks that followed, Ashari and human intelligence services alike discovered something that neither had anticipated. The information she had refused, across 12 years and multiple documented interrogation attempts to surrender, turned out to include fragments of an old Joint Task Force coordination protocol, a system that had, in the decades since her capture, been quietly superseded and largely forgotten by both militaries, its details considered obsolete by every officer who had ever reviewed it. Except for one detail neither government had realized until Mara Voss herself pointed it out during her own debrief, calmly, without any apparent awareness that she was handing investigators the key to something significant. The old protocol's authentication framework, buried and unused for a decade, had recently been quietly repurposed, without either government's full knowledge, by a splinter faction within the Raider Consortium's remaining command structure, who had discovered a way to spoof it and use it to forge false identification credentials across 3 border sectors. A vulnerability that had gone completely undetected by either side's current security systems, precisely because everyone assumed the old protocol was irrelevant. The intelligence officers who conducted that debrief, a joint human Ashari panel assembled specifically because of the unprecedented nature of the case, would later describe the moment Voss casually mentioned the detail as one of the strangest they had experienced in their careers, precisely because she herself did not seem to grasp, in that moment, quite how significant it was. She had simply been answering questions honestly, methodically, the way she had answered every question put to her since her recovery, and it was only when the senior Ashari intelligence analyst on the panel went very still and asked her to repeat the last portion of her answer twice that she seemed to register she had said anything of consequence at all. The exchange itself, preserved in the debrief transcript, was later cited so often in subsequent intelligence training modules across both militaries that it became something close to standard curriculum. The analyst had asked her plainly why she had continued protecting the old task force protocol details even after 12 years, when by any conventional strategic assessment the information should have long since ceased to carry any real value. She had answered without hesitation, in the same steady, unadorned tone the recording engineer noted had characterized nearly every answer she gave throughout the entire multi-day debrief. She said that she had never actually been protecting the information because she believed it still mattered tactically. She had simply decided in the earliest weeks of her captivity that she was not going to be the reason anything her people had built, however small, however outdated, fell into the hands of the people who had taken everything else from her, and that once she had made that decision, revisiting it every time the facility's interrogators asked her to reconsider would have meant admitting the decision was negotiable in the first place. It wasn't, so she never gave them the chance to find out otherwise. She later told Korrin Vey, with a note of dry amusement that he found himself deeply grateful to hear from her again, that 12 years of protecting something out of sheer stubborn principle had apparently turned out to be useful after all, and that she supposed she owed her old instructors at the academy an apology for every time she'd rolled her eyes at a lecture on the long-term value of institutional memory. Mara Voss, in other words, had spent 12 years protecting information that both governments had long since dismissed as worthless, information that turned out in the end to be the single most valuable piece of intelligence recovered from the entire collapse of the Raider Consortium, not because it was tactically current, but because her captors had found a way to weaponize its obsolescence in a way no one still fighting the war had thought to anticipate. Her refusal to surrender it, sustained across 12 years for reasons she herself had described as being about identity rather than strategy, closed a security gap that could have cost both militaries considerably more than anyone in that debrief room was initially prepared to admit. This is the twist this story has been building toward, and it is worth sitting with it honestly rather than dressing it up as something cleaner than it actually was. Mara Voss did not endure 12 years of captivity because she foresaw a strategic payoff. She endured it because she had decided, on a purely human, purely personal level, what kind of person she intended to remain regardless of the cost, and it was precisely that decision, made for reasons that had nothing to do with tactics, that turned out to matter more than any calculated act of resistance could have. Her honor was not a strategy. It never needed to be. It simply turned out, as honor sustained long enough so often does, to be worth more than anyone calculating purely in terms of strategy could have predicted. Korrin Vey formally recommended her for the highest decoration a Shari command bestows on any officer, human or otherwise, a recommendation the Joint Command Council approved without a single dissenting voice, an unprecedented unanimity that several longtime officers on that council noted with some wonder had never once occurred in the council's recorded history. But Mara Voss, when informed of the honor during her recovery, asked for exactly one modification to the ceremony before she would agree to accept it. She did not want it held in a formal command auditorium in front of assembled dignitaries. She asked instead that it be held aboard the same class of vessel the Meridian had once been, with her 4 surviving crew members standing beside her, and with Korrin Vey himself pinning the decoration, because, as she put it in a request that made even the most seasoned protocol officers in the room go quiet, some debts are meant to be honored by the person who actually understands what they cost. He did exactly that, months later, aboard a ship whose corridors smelled faintly of the same recycled air the Meridian once had, in front of 4 crew members who had survived 12 years alongside her, and who each, in turn, credited her openly and without hesitation as the entire reason any of them still stood there at all. And when the ceremony ended, when the formal words had been spoken and the decoration properly fastened, Korrin Vey did something no protocol on either side of the alliance required of him. He knelt briefly, the way he had knelt at the edge of her cot on the day the door first opened, and he told her, quietly enough that only she could hear it, that he had spent 12 years believing he owed a debt to a ghost, and that he intended to spend whatever years remained to him making sure the living woman in front of him never again had to wonder whether anyone was still looking for her. Later that same evening, once the formal proceedings had ended and the ship's corridors had quieted, the 2 of them sat together in a small observation lounge near the vessel's aft section, the kind of unremarkable room every escort-class ship carries, a few worn chairs bolted to the deck, and a viewport looking out onto whatever stars happened to be passing. It was, Mara Voss pointed out with the same dry humor Korrin had missed more than he'd ever fully admitted to himself, almost exactly the kind of room where the 2 of them used to sit during the 4 months of the original joint patrol, arguing about protocol and sensor readings, and, occasionally, nothing at all. "I keep waiting to feel like I've fully arrived somewhere," she admitted, watching the stars slide past in the dark beyond the glass. 12 years is a strange thing to come back from, Korrin. Everyone wants to treat it like a door that closes behind you the moment you walk through it. It doesn't work like that. Some mornings I still wake up counting breaths the way I taught Petra to, before my mind catches up and remembers I don't have to anymore. "Then don't rush it," he told her, settling into the chair across from hers with a stillness that felt, for the first time in 12 years, entirely unforced. You spent 12 years refusing to be shaped into someone else's version of you. I am not going to be the one who asks you to hurry up and become whoever everyone expects you to be now that you're home. Take as long as you need. I intend to still be here at the end of it, however long that takes. She looked at him for a long moment, the same steady, appraising look he remembered from their earliest disagreements aboard the Meridian, the look of a captain deciding whether an officer's word was one she could build a plan around. Whatever she found in his expression seemed to satisfy her, because something in her posture eased, fractionally, the particular ease of a person setting down a weight they had been carrying so long they'd nearly forgotten it was optional. "You know," she said, 12 years ago, on that last transmission, I told my crew I was proud of them, and I meant every word of it. But there's something I never got the chance to say to you, because I assumed I'd never get another chance to say anything to anyone again. I want to say it now properly, while I have the chance." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "You never did." "I know," she said. "That's exactly why I want to say it anyway." She reached over and set her hand briefly over his, the same unshowy gesture he remembered from 100 small moments aboard the Meridian, back when neither of them had any reason to think either one would need to spend a decade wondering if the other was still alive. "Thank you for never letting the report be the last word." 12 years in that facility, there were nights I genuinely believed I'd already been forgotten, filed away, written off as an acceptable cost of a war nobody was keeping careful track of anymore. I didn't know, obviously, what you were doing out here all that time. I couldn't have known. But some part of me kept deciding to survive anyway, and I think, looking back on it now, some part of me was betting, without any real evidence to justify the bet, that somewhere out there, someone stubborn enough hadn't actually let me go. Turns out I was right to bet on you. "You always were good at reading incomplete data," he said, and something in his voice, steady again now, carried the particular warmth of a man who had spent 12 years believing a debt could never be repaid, only to discover it had simply been waiting, patiently, for both of them to survive long enough to settle it together. Mara Voss did not survive 12 years of captivity because she was waiting to be rescued. She survived because she had already decided, long before any rescue came, exactly who she intended to be when it finally did. That, in the end, is the part of this story worth carrying with you, not the door, what was standing behind it unbroken the entire time. It would be easy, telling a story like this one, to let the fleets and the medals and the sweep of two civilizations settling an old debt overshadow the smaller truth underneath all of it. But that smaller truth is really the whole point. 12 years is a long time to hold on to a version of yourself that nobody is watching you protect. It is a long time to keep choosing dignity when dignity costs you something real every single day, with no guarantee that anyone will ever know you made that choice, let alone reward it. Mara Voss made that choice anyway, for 12 consecutive years, not because she expected a door to eventually open, but because she had decided, long before any door was even a possibility, that the choice itself was the only thing in that facility the raiders could never actually take from her. And Korrin Vey, on his end, spent those same 12 years choosing something almost as difficult in its own quieter way, refusing to let a stamped report be the final word on someone he respected, refusing to let institutional grief calcify into acceptance, carrying a debt he had no evidence he would ever get the chance to repay, and choosing, year after year, to act as though repayment might still someday be possible. Neither of them knew, across that entire decade, that the other was making the same kind of quiet, unglamorous, unwitnessed choice on the opposite side of a war neither of them could see the end of yet. That is, in the end, what makes the door mean what it means. Not one act of heroism. Two people, on two different sides of an impossible distance, independently refusing to become anything less than who they had always been, until the distance between them finally, improbably, closed. If you have ever waited for news of someone you loved and refused to believe the worst, even when every official report told you to, even when everyone around you had quietly begun to move on, then you already understand exactly what stood on either side of that door. You have carried some version of that same stubborn, unreasonable hope yourself, and you know that it does not always get rewarded, and that when it does, no ceremony, no decoration, no formal record can fully capture what it means to finally, after all that waiting, hear a familiar voice say your name again. If this story reminded you of someone you'd wait 12 years or 12 lifetimes to see walk through a door again, send it to them. They'll understand exactly why you did.